Hi, and welcome to this Palestra training video dealing with securing your home network. Now, in the previous video, we talked a little bit about securing your PC. Now let's go ahead and cover the actual network that your PC connects to. Okay, so what is a firewall? What's it do for us? Well, a firewall can either be a piece of software that resides on our machine, on our PC, or it could be hardware, which in most cases would be the wireless router that I talked about. Okay, so it could be either or. So let's say, for instance, we have our little network set up, and we have no wireless router because the wireless router is going to have firewall functionality built in. But in this case, in this example, let's say we don't have that. And all we have is a direct connection, our PC, directly to our cable modem or DSL modem. So we're basically here to the outside world. Well, we're going to need some piece of software residing on our machine to act as a firewall. And what a firewall does is it basically blocks ports. It's going to block ports on our computer so that the outside world can't pass through to us. Okay, so if you recall from our previous conversation, web traffic is going to take place over port 80. FTP traffic, well, let me write this out here. www or HTTP traffic comes in over port 80. Mail is going to be 110, which is POP 3. If we're going to send mail, that's port 25, SMTP. If we're going to FTP to something, a file transfer protocol, that's over port 21. Okay, so these are some common ones. If we're going to browse the internet, or basically resolve URLs to IP addresses, that's DNS. That's over port 53. So it can go on and on. Network news protocol for news groups, port 119, etc., etc. Well, we don't necessarily have to have any of these ports open. Let's say, for instance, I want to run a web server off my machine. If I wanted to actually allow the outside world to access my machine, and I have a web page sitting there where I'm actually hosting a website for the outside world to see, well, then I would need to open up port 80 on my firewall. Okay, so in doing so, I would open up port 80 on the firewall, and that would essentially allow traffic to pass through to my machine, and I could, of course, could then serve up web pages and so on and so forth. So depending on what you want to run off of your machine, you would have to open up certain ports. Typically, if you're not running any services on your machine that need access from the outside world, you won't necessarily have to really open up too many things. What happens typically is when you have a firewall in place, it will prompt you occasionally. It will go into what's called learning mode, and it will prompt you occasionally as to what's trying to access the internet. So when you run an application and the firewall doesn't know about that application, you'll get a prompt and say, hey, such and such an application is trying to run. Do you want to allow that to happen? Do you want to allow it just one time? Do you want to allow it basically all times? So by what you choose, when those prompts come up, the firewall will learn what is allowable traffic and what is not. So little by little, it will open up ports to allow communication to take place. Okay, now Windows XP has a firewall built in, and we can get to that by right-clicking on my computer, my network places, and going to Properties, or we can go down to our Start button, up to My Network Places, and right-click and go to Properties, and that will bring up the different connections on our network. Now I have several here. You may only have one showing on your machine. So if you right-click on that connection, the local area connection, go down to Properties, and then to the Advanced tab, you'll see the Windows Firewall, and then you'll see a Settings button. Go ahead and click that. From there, you'll have the option to have your firewall turned on, and if you have Windows XP Service Pack 2, which is the most recent version of XP, this is turned on by default. In XP Service Pack 1, that wasn't the case. You had to go in and manually turn it on. But if you have SP2, it's going to be turned on automatically. You can either don't allow exceptions, which basically means lock all the ports, don't let anything through, or you can turn it off completely. And if you turn off your firewall completely, you'll get a small little shield that pops up and maybe a message saying, hey, it's not a good idea. You probably don't want to do that. Well, if you have other things in place, like your wireless router, which will have a firewall, that's one level of protection. Or you may go ahead and choose a software solution, a third-party software solution instead. But for right now, let's go ahead and turn this on. And then when I talked about unlocking ports or opening up ports, we can do that here via the Exceptions tab. Now we could turn around and say, okay, these are the programs that it knows about that needs to have ports on the firewall opened up. So you could add a program if you needed to, or you could add a port if you needed to. So if you had, for instance, you were running a web server, you may go ahead and add a port for, call it web services, and give it a port number. Okay, so that way it would allow that to pass through the firewall. Now the firewall that comes with XP is fine, but if you want an alternative to that perhaps provides some more functionality, there are a number of alternatives out there. One that comes to mind happens to be Zone Alarm from a company called Zone Labs. It's a free download. They have a professional version that is a commercially available version. It's a pay version, but they also have a free version. Let me take you out to that website real quick. I just installed it on my machine. So if I click on my web browser, you'll notice since I have Zone Alarm running down in the corner, it's going to ask me, do you want to allow this program to access the internet? Okay. Now I can say allow or deny, and I can say remember this setting. So let me just go ahead and say allow. It's going to then allow the application to fire up, and do I want to allow, again, this to access the internet? Let me go ahead and hit yes for remember this setting, and allow. So now it's going out to the internet, and I can type in Zone Labs. From there, I can download their free program. If I click on the Home and Office button and go down to Zone Alarm, they have a free version of their firewall. Okay, so I can just go ahead and download that, which is what I did here. Okay, and it's zonelabs.com. There are many alternatives out there. I'm not pitching one over the other. I happen to have used this quite a bit in the past, so I'm familiar with the product. But again, once it installs, it's down here in the corner, and if I click on that, it's going to fire up their control panel. So it gives us a little bit of an overview of inbound, outbound protection, what it's blocked access to, so on and so forth. Okay, the firewall itself, we can configure different zones for what level of security we wish to put into place. Program control, we can say, we can choose rather whether a program has to ask for permission to access the internet or not, or if it tries to act as a server. Any antivirus monitoring, email protection, alerts and logs, and so forth. So this gives us an additional layer of protection over and above what the Windows firewall would be. So if you download a third-party firewall program, Zone Alarm or whatever one you happen to choose, you would go ahead and then turn off the Windows firewall. This would replace that. This just gives you a little bit more information, a little more control over what takes place, and as each application tries to access the internet, you'll get a prompting saying, hey, do you want to allow this to happen? Which I happen to like, because that way you know if there's some type of Trojan installed on your machine or some type of backdoor program that allows internet access, and you may not be aware of it. If you get a visual prompting, something that pops up and says, hey, this application's trying to access something here, do you want to allow that? That just gives you a little bit extra layer of security to know what's really coming in and going out of your machine.